I've known that I was privileged since I was 6 years old, and my older cousin told me that I was too spoiled to ever understand the problems other people were facing. I spent a lot of my life trying to prove that statement wrong, but I never quite did. In retrospect, I don't really want to ignore my privilege. I've learned that it's important to understand and accept where you come from before you can really help those who come from different places. I'm a white, upper middle class female college student who was given unlimited opportunities and choices throughout my educational career. I think I had to come to terms with this more when I left my private high school. I used to be like everyone else when I was surrounded by a million other college bound rich kids. Now I'm learning how I can use my privilege to help those who are disadvantaged by society. So, after thinking about my own education and considering all that I've learned in this class, I've come up with two different purposes of public education in a democratic society that I feel strongest about. So, just a disclaimer, these purposes do not encompass everything I think is important, and they do not even begin to describe all the inequalities in the educational system. So, my purposes are that, first of all, schools should allow students to define their own paths of success rather than forcing them into a path that society has chosen for them. And second, that schools should create more opportunities for students to succeed in schools. So, for the first one, students should be allowed to choose their own life path. A major setback to this is how schools are involved in tracking and ability grouping. Joel Spring discusses these in part in his book, American Education. He defines tracking as placing students into different curricula, such as college prep or vocational tracks. Students may not even realize it, but a lot of the time they are pushed onto certain tracks based on their teachers' perceptions of them, or their previous performance, or simply like where they came from. So, a quick personal example is my father, who grew up below the poverty line in Brooklyn, New York. He was a part of an Italian family in a mostly Irish area. Being different and poor, he was looked down on by many other people in his community, many people in his school. He was told throughout his entire life that he was not as smart as the other kids and couldn't stay focused like the other kids could. And in high school, his guidance counselor told him that college wasn't right for him. And so when he graduated high school, he went on to become a butcher, like many other Italian men at the time. So after almost like 10 years of him being a butcher, he realized that he wanted more out of his life and he went back to school. And his guidance counselor was completely wrong. He made Dean's List every semester in college and then went on to law school and is now a successful lawyer. It's just one example of how teachers and other administrators can be wrong about a student. Just because they perform a certain way does not mean they are meant for a specific path. Spring also describes ability grouping, which is placing students at a specific level of a class. So this is like AP classes or what have you. So this again is based on perceived ability and can be influenced by teachers' perceptions of a student's gender, race, or socioeconomic status. Young students often feel these perceptions and pressures from teachers and other adults and then succumb to them. Tracking and ability grouping directly leads to social reproduction, which Spring defines as the education system mimicking broader social class structures. So it's basically keeping the disadvantaged at a disadvantage, and it's a critical problem in the education system. James Coleman writes about a similar issue in his article, The Concept of Equality of Educational Opportunity. He says that schools tend to accept the children's expected future as a given. Um, they they tend to place students on tracks because of what they think they can do or will amount to. They may look at low income students and think that they won't go to college, so they treat them that way. Or they look at Hispanic students and believe they're not capable of learning in the same capacity as white students, so they treat them as such. Or teachers may think that black students never pay attention or are always getting into trouble, so they are sent to be disciplined more often. And then they think they're bad students, and that just rolls over into all other issues. And just one by one, each student is placed on a certain track of life without even looking at their individual differences or strengths. So schools need to allow students the right to define their own success, starting by allowing them to determine their own abilities. Educators need to let go of their preconceived notions and focus on each student, not the group they belong to. So my second purpose of public education is that schools need to provide opportunities for all students to succeed. I'm going to focus mainly on racial minorities and socioeconomic status because I believe they're some of the most severely affected groups, but like from this, and they also are pretty correlated. Statistically, racial minorities tend to also be of a lower socioeconomic group, but not always. So there's definite um, people that don't fall into those groups. But in Jennifer Hochschild's and Nathan Scrivonic's chapter on school finance, The authors discuss the ways in which schools are unequally funded. So, public education in America is financed by school districts, which is largely based on where people live. They say that where people live tends to be based on their income level, so therefore you can't separate education and social class because schools will be funded by the social class in their district. That means that students that are economically disadvantaged at home are also going to be economically disadvantaged at school, which means they're disadvantaged in resources. Schools in low income areas will receive less funding for textbooks, amenities, and qualified teachers. Children will grow up with the idea that they are not important because they received so little for their education. Without better resources, it's difficult for these students to succeed later in their educational careers. Jonathan Kozol talks about the issue in his book, The Shame of the Nation. He talks about how low income students are set at a disadvantage from the very beginning of their formal education. Some areas in the United States do not even have publicly funded preschools, so in these areas, high income kids will get to attend a private preschool, while low income kids will start their education a year later in kindergarten. These low income kids are set back an entire year of formal education. That's a whole year of language, a whole year of like learning how to pay attention in the Eurocentric views or whatever. So these disadvantages that start at a young age carry with them throughout their education. They continue to be behind or may lose faith in themselves and become further behind that way. And they could even be phased out of the education system altogether. So, in addition to their original setbacks, these students also receive less resources at home. So, they can't afford tutors like the high income students or um, just all the things that high income students get. Gloria Ladson Billings talks about this concept called accumulated disadvantage, where the oppression of minorities and low income people throughout American history has caused those groups to begin life at a lower social, economic, and political status even today. These low income and racial minority students receive less resources and have a lower quality education than their high income white counterparts. Society wants to keep the social order, and so they push the quote unquote lesser groups down. This is more of an issue for the government aspect of education, but school funding needs to be allocated to those schools in low income areas so we can bridge the gap between low and high income students. Every student should have the option to pursue any dream they want, and coming from a low income family should not hinder their academic experience. I believe these issues are most meaningful to me because of my educational experience. I was given so many choices and resources from like as many ACT or SAT tests to tutoring for them to as many colleges as I wanted to apply to. And I want students to have the same opportunities I had. I know that we're extremely far from that happening, but little differences in the education system can help close those gaps. So all students should get to succeed and choose their own success, and where you came from should not be the determining factor of where you're going.